Hi, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to Series 7 of the Climate Pioneers Show. This series, we are focused on my personal favourite topic of all time, hiring and building great teams. Hiring people is the absolute number one most important thing that you will do as the founder of a startup. And how you build out your early team is crucial because that's the foundation stone upon which the rest of your business is going to grow. So throughout the course of this series, I have been and will continue to be speaking to founders, investors, coaches, and specialists from across the spectrum of HR and talent to give you access to valuable insights and advice as you build out your business. And today I'm joined by Sherry White, an HR consultant who works specifically with startups and scale-ups to tackle challenges, unblock and improve leadership, establish strong foundations, face tough questions, and get things moving fast. She covers everything from people, culture, HR and employment law through to health and safety. So I'm really interested to dig into all of that with her today. Sherry, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you very much for having me. I am super excited to talk about this in this space because it's absolutely everything I love to do.
Fantastic, lovely. So kick off by telling me a bit more, if you don't mind, about the services you offer, because there's quite a breadth that you offer to the businesses that you partner with, and you cover a really interesting cross section. So how did this come about, and talk me through what you do?
How it came about really was because my background is very much in laboratory management. So I started off in labs 14 years ago, I think now. But I had kind of a management background in the past, and it turned out a lot of the skills were transferable. But what was a gap for me at the time was health and safety. Hugely different environment, lots of different risks to think about. So that kind of started me through my health and safety qualifications. And then HR kind of naturally followed because in a small business, you do wear many hats. You do have to pick up a lot of different things. And I wanted to make sure that I had the right foundations in place to be able to tackle that. So really, that's kind of where the journey started. And yeah, I spent 14 years working for other people, running various laboratories. But I knew my passion was very much about the people and culture piece. And that links both into HR and health and safety. So that kind of led me to then step out on my own, set up my own consultancy and be able to work with wider organisations and more businesses.
Lovely. And has that been quite a niche since you've been running Oxford People Solutions? Have you tended to focus on companies that have had that kind of lab, industrial manufacturing element to their work as well? Or has it really been a whole mix?
It's been quite varied. I guess labs, manufacturing is definitely the space I'm more familiar with. But I've also worked with sort of creative design companies, regulatory consultancies. There's quite a range of a customer base in there, but a lot of it does link back to STEM because a lot of them tend to find me because they work with STEM organisations.
I see. Interesting. And in your experience of working with STEM organisations and then non-STEM organisations, are there any particular people-related or HR-related challenges that you see come up in that STEM space that you don't see as much elsewhere? Are there particular issues that are unique to that environment, would you say?
That's a really interesting question. Think about how to word my response. I think one of the bigger challenges for STEM is that you've got highly technical people. And quite often they're the founders and they're fantastic at what they do. They have so much passion for what they do. But as those organizations grow, it can become really difficult to develop your skills, to have to do things like delegation, to have to trust in other people to do things, to navigate how to actually lead and manage other people, because you just want to do what you're passionate about. You want to, get your head down. You want to be at the lab bench. You don't want to be worrying about HR policies and all that kind of stuff. So I think that can be one of the bigger challenges. And it can be really, really difficult for people who are fantastic at what they do, who get promoted into leadership positions. And it can become quite overwhelming for them to have to deal with all of these different ways of thinking and all of these different people and how you accommodate all of those different people. That's definitely something I find a lot in STEM businesses.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. And I think that's a really common growing pain that companies go through as they go from that startup to scale up phase, is all of a sudden the people that were there in that founding team, who were probably hired because they were very good at doing the doing, then naturally get promoted up a level and people brought under them. And some people rise to that really well. Some people have done it in prior organizations, but actually a lot of the time they haven't, or they haven't been formally trained in how to do that. And it is really difficult. And I think that's where I suppose all the good intentions of company culture can start to become unpicked, right? Is when you put people into management roles that aren't like living and breathing that, I suppose.
Yeah, it can be really, really challenging. And, founders can only get so involved. As the business grows, they have got to be able to step back. Maybe they don't want to. And I work with organisations that work along those lines too. If the founders want to be stuck in the day, absolutely, that's not a problem. But then they've got to have somebody who can manage the organisation for them and who can deal with all of those challenges. So certainly in recruitment terms, that's one of the bigger things that I work on, is trying to understand, is what they're recruiting for what they need, or actually have they thought about all of the possibilities? Because you don't necessarily have to step up into just being a business operator. You can stay exactly where you feel comfortable, as long as you are confident enough in somebody else to deal with things like your sales or things like your people management. There's a lot of options to explore.
Yeah, absolutely. And what stage of organizations do you tend to work with, from that kind of startup, scale up, more established? Is it a spectrum? And again, do you see kind of core issues that come up at each one of those stages?
I work with a real variety. They're mostly on the micro side. So it'll be from taking on your first employee to getting your fifth employee, and then suddenly going, oh, there's more health and safety legislation I need to think about, through to sort of 20, 30, 50 employees. But most of them are certainly less than 100. And definitely more on the probably less than 20 side, or around about that kind of size. And that's at the point where either they've got nothing in place, or they've got a few things in place and they've kind of just gone with the flow, but it's starting to hit a few challenges. They need to think a bit more commercially. And that's where I tend to come in. I'd love to come in a bit earlier than that, if I'm honest. But it's just how things grow organically, and it's them realizing, we really need to address this and try to streamline things, and really look at how we manage people as well as manage processes, and explore software options. There's so many different things that can be done.
Absolutely. And what are the parts of the sort of HR and people processes that you tend to see most commonly neglected in those early days? So when you come in, what are the bits where, of course, they've not thought about it, or it's all a bit chaotic? Are there,
I would say consistent policy seems to be quite common, because a lot of organizations will do wonderful things. They want to do great things for people and they want to support their teams. But it will be a case of, someone raises something, so it's, oh, well, let's put that in place. But those conversations just happen naturally. And no one sits back and goes, well, actually, let's take some time to look at this and think about, what can we offer to our employees? What do we expect from our employees? And how can we make sure that we're thinking ahead about what might become a problem, so that there's a clear guidance on what we do in those situations?
Interesting. And so in terms of that, I mean, what are the basics that they should have in place when it comes to policy, do you think, pretty much from the beginning? And where are some clear gaps you think are often missed there?
I would say it definitely depends on which HR consultant you speak to. Some will just give you a policy bundle. I like to work on a very simplistic basis because of the size of the organisations I work with. I don't see the need for lots of lengthy policies. I try to make one simple, tailored handbook that has everything you need in it. So it's a guide for the employees to know what to expect in terms of, how to book holiday and what your holiday allowance is. What happens if you're off sick? What happens if you have a medical appointment? All the sort of basic things. And understanding the sort of legal rights from both sides as well. What happens if you have a complaint or you want to raise a grievance? What happens if you do something that you shouldn't be doing? What sort of disciplinary policy is in place? What do they expect? And what should the organisation do there? As well as things like, equality and inclusion, and making sure that you're your values are very clear throughout everything that you do. And that's one of the real key things for me. It's what's your mission? Where are you aiming to be? What are the values that are at the core of your business? And how do you want to translate them through the behaviours you expect from your employees?
And would you communicate that in a handbook as well, the values and the behaviours piece? Yeah.
And I think everything that you write in your policy should be around that. Everything should be, you know, written inclusively, written in line with exactly what you believe. And I think that makes a really big difference to how people engage with it as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. And can startups make their own? So could they pull kind of pro forma policies together and sort of pull them together almost into a sort of Notion document, I'd say, you know, where they can write their own policy, you know, they can write the how-tos and, you know, have it as like a sort of centralized wiki almost for this is what working here looks and feels like. Is that they can do that?
I think that's a fantastic idea. Make it digital, make it engaging. And I think, you know, in terms of the legal side of things, making sure that you're looking at places like ACAS, because they have all the codes of conduct in place. So a lot of what you need in legal terms, you can just be referencing the ACAS code of conduct, for example. Alternatively, you know, there are websites like my own where I will have a template there that somebody can buy and modify. So the groundwork is there, they just make it their own. I love the idea of creating something from Notion. I think that's fantastic. How-tos, and a lot of STEM organisations as well, certainly in the backgrounds that I've been in, are very much driven by quality standards. So they might have certain expectations that need to be met. So they might need to have a system of SOPs. And there's nothing worse than a really dull SOP that doesn't do anything for the organisation. So it's bringing your values into everything that you do. You know, an SOP doesn't just have to be do this, do this, do this. It can be a bit more engaging and interesting.
Yeah, I love that. Okay, perfect. And when it comes to benefits, that's one that founders ask me a lot about during the recruitment process. And I think there's this tension between, okay, there's a legal minimum of things that I have to offer, but I want to be an attractive place to work, and I want my benefits to reflect our values, which are that we're people-led as a business, and we want people to feel valued. So we want an amazing benefits package, but I also haven't got any money. So what advice do you give to startups as they go through that journey, and about really what is the basic expectation about what benefits should be in place? What do employees actually want, and how can they think about laddering up those benefits over time?
I think the biggest benefit, I mean, obviously, you know, people need to pay the bills. They need to be paid a decent wage. But the biggest benefit is a fantastic company culture and a fantastic mission, in all honesty, and especially in the STEM sector, because people want to be a part of what you're doing. And, you know, that can be more beneficial than anything. But, you know, in terms of, I guess, tangible benefits, there are certain things you can do. There are things like BHN Extras, which is kind of a free service. So that's something that anyone could look at. And I put this sort of stuff in my newsletter as well. So if anyone's interested, you know, I'm always putting recommendations in there of things I come across that are fantastic for small organisations. Things like an EAP, an employee assistance programme, they've come under a bit of fire lately because there's been some bad ones around, but they support things like mental health. They encourage people to have conversations. There's counselling services, and you can get them from as little as, I think it's about £8.50 per person per year.
Wow.
So, you know, it's not all benefits are as expensive as organisations feel. And I think finding a good broker or finding someone who's got a bit more knowledge around those can be really, really valuable. Because, people might want things like private medical cover. I mean, it's getting harder to contact GPs now, but they're really expensive benefits to offer. But you can also tailor benefits to different levels of employee. You know, as much as it might not be an ideal solution, it might be if you've been here for a certain length of time, then your benefits improve, and that can be a really good retention strategy. So, you know, after 1 year you get access to this, after 2 years you get access to that. And that helps to manage the cost as well. So that can be a really nice way to balance things out.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in early stage startups, one of the things that's often part of the package is equity. And I think there can sometimes be a disconnect between how the importance that founders place on equity and how much incoming starters value it.
Yes.
And I know that founders would push back on that and say, well, if they don't value it, then are they the right person? But I think it's an interesting one. How often is that something that you come across, and what are your thoughts there on offering equity? Should it be part of the package? Is it something that really motivates and drives people? And what are the challenges that kind of come up with that as well?
Oh, it's a tough one, isn't it? I think that really depends on the people, because I can understand from a founder's perspective why it's fantastic. But from an employee perspective, you've got bills to pay, you've got a family to support. So it's how far down the line and what guarantees are there that I'm really going to get anything out of this?
Yeah.
So it's trying to look at it from both perspectives. You know, it's, yeah, equity might be great, but perhaps bonuses based on company performance could also be considered, because that's something that's a bit more, I guess, likely to happen sooner rather than later.
Yeah.
And in some cases, it depends on the legal structure of the organisation. So, you know, is it public shares, or is it a case of it's when the organisation is sold? There's so many different equity schemes, and some of them you have to buy into. So yeah, I think it really just depends, and it's not a bad thing to offer, but I wouldn't see it from an employee perspective necessarily as the sort of be all and end all of the benefits program.
Yeah, I think that's fair enough. Yeah. Okay. And when it comes to hiring, both the recruitment piece of that, but also when people come on board, that onboarding and setting them up for success piece, what are some of the common areas of neglect you see there in companies that you go into, and what do you consider to be a real kind of best in class, I hesitate to use as a phrase, but a really good solid recruitment onboarding structure for companies?
I think it's really easy for organisations to get into the I'm too busy stage and not spend enough time with people necessarily, but focusing on what people's strengths are, and even down to making sure that they know where basic things are. And I think a lot of the time people can be left kind of alone to do it. So, oh, go meet this person, go meet that person. So I always try to work on a really solid step-by-step foundation induction that it includes things like, let's make sure you know where the toilets are. Let's make sure you know where the kitchen is. Where can you store your food? You know, what shops are nearby, or what food vans are nearby for when you have lunch. And it's just thinking about those little things that make their life a bit easier and show actually that you're thinking about them when they come in the door. So those are real sort of, you know, week one basics. But in terms of longer term, people are driven by knowing that they're making a difference. They're driven by knowing that they're going somewhere. So it's understanding what their milestones are. Are there progression opportunities, which can be really difficult when you're small as well. But it doesn't necessarily have to be upwards progression. It might be sideways progression. It might be department shifting. It might be learning new skills in different areas of the organisation. So being able to understand what engages people and what they want to do going forward means in driving your induction program around that almost. And that benefits your organisation, because they learn so much more about everything more that you do, which means they're more bought in, they're more likely to stay for longer, and they become, you know, an ambassador for selling what your product is. So communication is the really key thing. It's making sure they've got somebody there that they can go to and they feel comfortable that they can go to them. You know, it's not, oh, you're too busy, we'll reschedule that later. As much as that's really tough, really difficult when you're wearing 10 hats and you're trying to do all these different things. And if it's not you doing it, make sure somebody's doing it. Somebody's taking the time to really bring them into the team and making them feel part of that organisation.
Yeah. And I think you're right, in an early stage environment or in a busy growing startup environment, that can be tough, right? Because nobody's got the time. So it's making sure that there's somebody's being accountable, owning that, I suppose, whether that's like a mentor or a buddy within the business, I suppose, that's being that kind of friendly face and checking in. Yeah. And onboarding itself and the training and onboarding piece is an interesting one, because in those very early days, it's quite founder led. And as the organization scales, how you delegate that out and how you make that a scalable process is really interesting. Have you got any kind of tips around that?
Actually, that's where something like Notion could probably be really useful. So I tend to use Asana, so it's very much an equivalent. But building your onboarding processes into that, I find, is a really nice way to capture and make sure everyone's covered everything they need.
Right.
Because one of the worst ways I've seen things happen is just from the expectation that it's on one person. There's no written process, there's no written prompts, so information will get missed. One person might be told something that the next person isn't. So it's making sure that your core principles are all in there, and it's what are the clear expectations. What's week 1 look like? What does month 1 look like? What does month 3 look like? And you can build that into quite a core structure for everybody, and then just have additional tasks or things depending on where they work. So if they're lab based, they might have to do this extra little bit of induction, or if they're admin based, they focus on that area. It's just making sure there's a clear structure in there, and then that makes them accountable for it because they have those tasks, but they also know who they need to go to as part of that, and it's all laid out in the project. So it's just an induction project, and I would say it needs to last a good 6 months to make sure they're fully settled in. And at that point, you then look at what they might need to do going forwards.
Interesting. And I like that idea of it almost being modular. So depending on, you've got your core modules that everybody will do, and then departmental modules or based on their level of experience. How do you feel about video recorded sessions rather than in-person delivered sessions? Do you think that brings in too much of a level of impersonality, or like a level of remove, or not?
I think it really depends. I would say there needs to be a mix, because if your entire induction is just watching videos, you're very quickly going to switch off. But if I like to make it a mix of, you've got to read a few SOPs because, we work under a quality system. We have to work to SOPs. You have to understand the quality structure. But then we go and, spend a couple of hours with somebody in the QA department, and we learn a bit about what they do. We might watch a video about a certain piece of equipment that we might have to operate, but then we get to go off and practically use it. So we get to take that theory and we get to make it real. And I find that's the most effective way to learn. It's the most effective way to engage. And it really just brings everything to life. It doesn't have to be a burden on one person. You've got different people in the team. You've got different bits of kit, or however it is you operate. Get them to spend an hour or so with the new person and show them what life is really like. Yeah.
Perfect. And where HR consultants, I think, can sometimes and often be brought in is where there are problems, right? Where there are people problems. One of the kind of, I don't know if you'd call it a truism, but one of the phrases that I hear often in the world of startup recruitment is that you should hire slow and fire fast.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that as an HR and people professional? And I appreciate it is nuanced and it's going to be on a case-by-case basis, but do you think that is a good motto for startups to live by, or not? Do you think we fire too fast or not fast enough in a lot of cases?
Oh, that's a tough one. I say yes and no. If someone's not working out, they're not working out. You need to deal with them. But why are they not working out? Is it them, or is it the fact that you just haven't given them enough time and resource or an efficient enough induction to actually get them to engage in your processes? It could be, the answer could be either. So I'm definitely all for an uncomplicated exit process. You don't need to jump through loads of hoops. If somebody's new, it is easier in legal terms, as much as that sounds awful, doesn't it? But you've got to strike that balance of what's best for the organization versus what's best for the people. And you've got to think about the rest of the team.
Yeah.
If you've got somebody in there who just isn't engaging with you, and they're clearly unwilling, and they're, for whatever reason, if you've done what you can to bring them in and you've done what you can to build them up, and it's just not working, you need to just deal with it. You need to just, make that process clean and simple, and not drag it out, because dragging it out and letting it fester spreads through the organization, and it's just never a positive thing.
No, No, I think there can be a tendency, to your point about, is it because have you done enough? I think there can be a real tendency as a founder or as a manager to get stuck on that point, and perhaps get stuck on that point for a little bit too long, and not want to, they're not the right person, but there's always that shred of doubt in you of, well, maybe it was me, maybe I didn't do enough, maybe I just need to help them a bit more. And I think that can carry on for quite a long time, really, before you make the final decision. From a legal standpoint, what is the requirement of what an organisation at that point needs to do? So it's under 2 years, maybe even under a year, and it's very clear, it's very apparent, you've done all you can to try to bring that person on, but it's not happening. What would you say is the best and most sort of legally sound and compliant way for an organisation to then, part ways?
Firstly, I would say don't sit on it for that long. And that is something that really can happen, because you kind of hope that it just goes away because you're busy and you need to focus on what you're doing. But, I think having a robust probation period is really, really good and really beneficial. And I think as we're starting to see legal changes that are going to come into play as well with the new Labour government, that's going to become even more important. But a lot of people use a probation period as a way to exit people if they don't work out. But actually what they don't do is go through that induction to make sure that we've done our bit. So making sure you've done your bit is really key. But if at 6 months we haven't got there and we don't feel we're going to get there, let's have that conversation and let's just work out that route to exit. The only thing you need to be wary of is disabilities. So, and I think that is something that can really worry people, especially startups, because you don't have an HR department. You don't necessarily know exactly what all disabilities look like. Some disabilities aren't visible. And there are certainly people who, if they feel under threat, will go on sick. And, is that because they genuinely get anxious? Is that because they've tried and they can't do it? Or is that because they just are playing the system? There are different ways depending on who you're dealing with. So I would say, to save your sanity, in all honesty, is get a consultant in to just deal with that process for you.
I was going to say, the disability one is a very difficult one, isn't it? I mean, I had a really interesting episode of this series last week with a lady who does some similar work to you, actually, in terms of neurodiversity consulting, right, as well, which I know is an issue close to your heart and that you do a lot of work in that space. And one of the things that came out in that episode was the high proportion of people in the STEM sector that do identify as neurodivergent, but the incredibly low percentage of those that disclose it to their employer. So I suppose that then brings in a challenge from an employer's perspective. If you think that you've done the best job that you can to onboard those people, but they're not performing, but perhaps they're not performing because you're not addressing their needs, but they haven't disclosed they have those needs, that's a very difficult people in HR situation to unpick.
Yeah, it can be. I mean, ultimately, you can only do what you know. You can only act on what you know, if someone hasn't disclosed something. But, there is also an element of, well, how much can you educate yourself on what you might need to look for? So, again, I think working with a consultant that can maybe pick those triggers up is really useful. But if they've got to a point where they've gone off sick, that should be a trigger to say, well, there should be something on that fit note that gives you an indication as to what's going on there. But it really does come down to company culture as to whether people feel comfortable opening up. And it's not going to happen overnight, especially if they've been somewhere in the past where they've been badly treated. And it's something hugely close to my heart. And I'm in the process of creating an online community to provide information and resources to neurodivergent people to get support quicker, because it is becoming a situation that's really spiraling. And we are seeing a lot of negativity around it. There's a lot of misinformation. There's a lot of people going, ADHD is just a new trend.
Yes, yeah.
Or it's, it wasn't around when I was a kid. Why is there suddenly so many people getting diagnosed? And it's not that it wasn't there. It's just that we had to mask. We had to hide who we were. We had to learn to conform to societal norms. And actually that meant that we died younger, that, our mental health was so severely affected that the suicides were higher in that community. And yeah, absolutely. There's a huge proportion of neurodivergent people in STEM, because a lot of neurodivergent people are incredibly highly intelligent and highly focused on specific things. And that's what makes them so fantastic in that sector. But yeah, there are also then challenges with your environment, with sensory needs. So there's a lot of push at the moment for big open plan offices and for hot desking and all this stuff that's seen as efficient for the business. Personally, I don't agree. I think it's very counterproductive. And from a safety perspective as well, I think there's a lot of issues with it, and I'm not sure how long it will be around for. But I can understand from a business perspective, you need less space, you can share desks, you need less equipment. But in those situations, if you've got somebody in an open plan desk that seems clearly uncomfortable, who doesn't engage, let's have that conversation about how do they feel about sitting in that environment. You don't need to turn around to somebody and say, oh, are you neurodivergent? It's just,
yeah.
How are you finding work? How are you feeling, about the lighting? How are you feeling about the noise? How are you feeling about the environment around you? And a lot of basic things like DSE assessments will actually ask those questions. So it's just making sure that you're fulfilling your basic safety needs. And if you're not sure where to go with something like a DSE assessment, again, it's getting somebody in that can look at that from a legal perspective, but also from a reasonable adjustments perspective, and just say, maybe if we can put this person in a quieter space, that will make a huge difference to how they perform.
Yeah. I think to your point there, and we mentioned about the levels of neurodivergence being higher in STEM. I read a really interesting article literally just this morning that an investor in my network had written about an equally high percentage of particularly people with ADHD in the entrepreneur community, because again, a lot of the traits that make you a great founder or a good entrepreneur are very strongly correlated with ADHD traits. So that kind of creativity, that big picture thinking, that, that pace that you want to move at, and risk taking, all of these things kind of stack up. And so I suppose if you're in an early stage startup within tech, that cross section of the two, that intersection is going to mean that you probably do have a very high percentage of your workforce that identify as neurodivergent. But a colleague and I were speaking about this the other day and saying, actually, surely everybody is sort of on a spectrum of neurodivergence somewhere, right? And it's not so much about do you or don't you identify as a particular label, but perhaps what do you as an individual need? Because even people who do identify under the same label might manifest in different ways. They might have different needs around that. For some people, it might be the lighting that really bothers them. For somebody else, it's the noise. For somebody, it's both. There's lots of different needs and requirements. So I suppose, taking that stance that you're just working with everybody on an individual level to make sure that they're comfortable, regardless of what they may or may not want to disclose. I think it's just a really good place to start. But I think it takes educating yourself, right, to begin with, and understanding the prevalence, and that it's a majority, not a minority.
Exactly. And I think that's what we'll start to see. It's probably going to take the next 5 years or so for us to really start to understand that. But I think we will see that, it's not just another trend. It's just something that we're learning about. It's something that we're discovering. But I also understand how overwhelming it can feel for a founder to think, well, if I've got to cater to everybody individually, like, how have I got time? How am I going to afford that? But it comes down to your engagement and your communication with your teams, because actually, if you just pop them all out a series of questions, it's how important is this to you on a scale of 1 to 10, and collate your responses, because we all love a bit of data, don't we? Then that might help you to put a couple of things in place that actually improves the majority of your workforce.
Yeah, absolutely. And you said, how early should somebody consult the expertise of an HR professional, do you think?
That's a really tough question, because it depends, I think, on what you've got already. Have you used an HR consultant in the past? Have you got any element of it yourself? Have you already got policies? And I see people at all stages. It's really nice when I see someone who's about to start recruiting. They're like, I need to take on my first person. I don't want to get my hands dirty. I want this just dealt with. And that's fantastic, because it just means that you're fully aware of everything from day one. But in probably a lot of cases, people have gone and got various policies or things off of Google. They found sort of cheap and cheerful resources, or maybe they've engaged with somebody years and years ago, because some startups, take a lot longer to get to that point where they need other people. And they're really out of date, and they're really, 90s written. They're not very inclusive, and they're probably completely legally incorrect as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's important to just have a conversation with somebody, because a conversation doesn't cost you anything. And just say, this is what we've got. What do you suggest? Do we need something? Are we okay? And if someone tries to then sell you, thousands and thousands of pounds worth of stuff, they're probably just going to always try and sell you thousands of pounds worth of stuff.
Yeah.
But if they align with your values and they're someone that just genuinely wants to help, they will say, well, what you've got sounds reasonable, or maybe we could tweak a few things. It might cost a little bit, but or one of the big benefits is having HR just in the background on a retainer. So a lot of people do that, and it's generally a lower cost way of doing it. It means that if things come up, you've got someone you can contact, and they will normally include things like policy reviews and make sure that all your legal compliance is up to date as part of that.
And how often should you do that? Because as you said, the law changes, regulations are changing all the time. Your policies can be badly worded or a bit dated. How often should you do a health check of your policies, your contracts?
Most consultants will do them annually, but there can be legal changes twice a year.
Okay.
So it really just depends. So something I will do is, for example, I'll do an initial review of whatever is in place, and make sure it's legally compliant. And then, in terms of if they want more done than that, that's driven by them, because some people just want policies, legal compliance. That's fine if that's what they want. But if they want to go on to more of a culture piece, then we can work on that as well. But I will always make sure that, my newsletters always include legal updates, and anyone that's on a retainer will always get additional information, or this is what's in your policy, this is what I propose, and, we just kind of get on with it in the background. And if there needs to be awareness, again, that's down to them if they want to do that, if they want me to do that. I'm quite happy to drive the whole thing. Quite often that depends on their budget. So, I'll work with each organisation based on what it can afford, and, what I can give. I like to give as much as possible, because some people, they've got minimal budgets. It can be really, really difficult. And I'm not going to just leave them non-compliant. Some people might just say, well, I can only afford HR. I can't afford health and safety yet. I was like, well, I'm at least going to make sure you've got, a legally compliant health and safety policy. I'm not just going to leave that bit out because you can't afford it, because, it doesn't feel right to me. So yeah, I think it's just making sure you engage with somebody that you can build a good relationship with yourself.
Absolutely. And if people would like to talk further to you about the services you offer, where can they find you?
So I'm very active on LinkedIn. Do love my LinkedIn space. Alternatively, through my website, so it's oxfordpeoplesolutions.co.uk, or from my email, which is just sherry@oxfordpeoplesolutions.co.uk.
Fab. And how can they find your newsletter?
That's a really good question. I'm pretty sure they can subscribe on my website, but I will double check and make sure that's available, because I have a VA that does that. She's fantastic.
Oh, lovely. And just before we go, are you able to share any further details about the community, the neurodivergent community that you are starting? Is that something that exists already? Is it, in design stage? It's
in the works in the background. It's definitely been a bit more challenging being neurodivergent myself, to focus on some of the resources. But I do plan to launch in December. It will be called Nerdiverse, because that was a cute little play on words. I wanted Neuroverse, but it was taken. So Nerdiverse seemed quite fitting. And I believe our website will be nerdiverse.org, which will be launched in the next week or so. And people will be able to sign up. And I will certainly be offering, it's definitely going to be a paid element to the community. Very low cost, but, we need to cover our costs. But the whole concept of it is we'll be looking for partners, we'll be looking for sponsors. And we want to be able to support people who either are diagnosed, are considering seeking diagnosis, or are just supporting somebody else who they feel might be neurodivergent. And we want to be able to use those funds to provide a pot to support people get diagnosis, because waiting lists on the NHS are years and years. Services are starting to close. So yeah, I want to turn it into, you know, a real social value, not-for-profit organisation that can really try to help the community. So, and yeah, well, absolutely be offering, you know, free places initially, just so I can get feedback and do a bit of a soft launch on it as well. So yeah, people are more than happy to contact me or connect with me on LinkedIn if they want to find out more about that.
Fantastic. That's great. Well, Sherry, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for sharing those insights with us today. Good luck with building the community. It sounds like something that, especially in tech, especially in the world of startups, is going to be crucially important.